So a couple of announcements before we get started here. First of all, I think everybody on this call knows me, but for those of you who may not, I'm Julie O'Leary, and I'm the president of the McCabe Chapter of the Izaak Walton League. So thanks for being here. A couple of pieces of information to share with you at the outset of the meeting. About upcoming events that you might be interested in. One is that a reminder to renew your membership for calendar year 2023 if you have not done so, or if you're not a member, this is an invitation to become a member of the Izaak Walton League for this year. And we either Molly or Martha or I, one of us will put a link into the chat. You can do that online. If you're a member, you've received a mailing in the mail, and you might receive another one, but you can definitely renew your membership online, and we hope that you'll do that and continue to support the work that we're doing. A couple of events coming up we wanted to make sure people knew about. One is tomorrow already. There's a meeting, FEMA meeting on the changes to the revised flood insurance rate maps. So FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and they're going to be holding a meeting in Duluth to review changes they've made to the flood insurance maps. So if you live in a flood zone, if you have flood insurance, which kind of sounds ridiculous, but it's really not to those of us who've lived in Duluth long enough to know what has happened here in the past. There have been some changes to those maps, and they're going to be explaining those and how they might affect your insurance, and also taking public input. So though that meeting for South St. Louis County, which would be most of us here, is Thursday from 5 to 7 p.m. at the Pike Lake Conference Room at the County Public Works Building, which is 4787 Midway Road. And I can put that information into the chat. I know that Rich put it in his newsletter as well. So if you are on the email list and you get the newsletter, you would have seen that information. The other notice that we wanted to make sure that everybody is aware of is the next Wednesday. The legislature is in session, and there's a lot happening. It's going fast and furious this year. Next week, Thursday at noon, it's Boundary Waters Day at the Capitol, and this is an event being sponsored by the Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters, which we've been active in and supportive of. So the plan is that there's going to be a rally on the south steps of the Capitol at noon with Will Steger and Becky Rahm. They're encouraging people to meet with their legislators afterwards. I'm not sure if they're scheduling meetings or if you need to schedule your own meetings, but I'll put that registration link into the chat when I'm done talking here. And if you're interested, you can go and register, and I would assume you can ask them if they would be scheduling those meetings. Okay, that's the announcements I have. And with that, I want to introduce our speaker for tonight. We're really fortunate to have Abby Hileman, who's the SaltWatch coordinator for the Izaak Walton League's national office headquarters with us. So she began in this role at the league last August 2022. And before that, she's worked as a professional bird trainer. She's been an environmental educator, a naturalist, and also a retail supervisor. So her goal with us is to provide resources to make lasting change and help us put the information she's going to be sharing into action. She's a firm believer that small scale actions like water monitoring and planting native plants make a huge difference. So Abby's going to talk about the IKE's National SaltWatch program broadly. And then we also have with us tonight, our other presenter is one of our own members who's a familiar face to many of you, Bob Tammond. And Bob's a longtime member of this chapter. He's active in a lot of initiatives in and around our part of the state. Bob's a retired electrician who had a career in the mines, and he and his wife, Pat, have been very effective advocates for clean water. They live up near the Iron Range in the town of Sudan, and they've spent a lot of years canoeing in the boundary waters and have been very invested in work to protect our waters from mining pollution. So Bob's been actually doing some monitoring of surface waters for conductivity, which he will explain more about. So Abby's going to talk first, and Bob's going to talk about his work, and then we'll have a chance at the end to answer questions. So please hold your questions, and you can type them into the chat if you'd like, but I think there'll also be an opportunity for people to just ask those questions at the end. And I would ask you all to please make sure that you are muted. Feel free to turn off your camera during the presentation. And with that, Abby, please begin.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and present here. So as Julie said, my name is Abby Hileman, and I'm the SaltWatch coordinator at the national office in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is pretty close to Washington, D.C. The SaltWatch program, it actually started in Maryland in 2018. One of our clean water fellows at the time, they were doing water monitoring in a local stream that's right by the national office headquarters. And one day they discovered this enormous salt spill that's in this picture right here that you can sort of see it mostly at the bottom of the screen. And it was right outside of the national office headquarters. And there's actually a bridge basically where this roadway goes. And this salt spill was on top of a storm drain that led directly to the waterway below, which is the Muddy Branch, which eventually leads into the Potomac River. And that's one of the rivers that gives over 2 million people water within the DC area. So he wasn't really sure what to do in this situation. He called a couple of government city officials, the city and the county, to figure out whose jurisdiction is this, how can we get this salt spill cleaned up. Eventually we figured out whose jurisdiction this spill belonged to, and it was cleaned up by the city officials, but unfortunately not before the chloride levels in the Muddy Branch, the stream below this roadway, spiked to toxic levels basically overnight. Based on the success of our Save Our Streams program, we began the SaltWatch program, and it has since expanded into a national monitoring effort across the United States. I think we've had about 28 states participate, and I'll show you some statistics a little bit later on our results since the inception of this program. Our goals for the program: to raise awareness in the general public about the connection between salt and stream health, to identify chloride hotspots in freshwater, and to advocate for smarter salt application on roadways by sharing some of those results with private landowners and local and state agencies. As part of our program, we give out free chloride testing strips in our SaltWatch kits to anyone who's interested in testing local waterways for chloride pollution or road salt pollution, and to advocate and to push people to advocate for smarter salting practices within their region. And I did want to mention too, I am going to use the words salt and chloride interchangeably throughout this presentation. So don't get too confused about that. So what really is road salt? There's 4 different types. There's sodium chloride, which is the most common and also happens to be the least expensive. There's potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, and then also calcium chloride. And I did also want to mention that although road salt is the biggest contributor to chloride in the environment and in local streams and waterways, there are other sources of chloride entering the environment through things like water softener discharge as well. But these are the four most common types of salt that we use. And salt works by lowering the freezing temperature of water, but it only works down to a certain degree. And so sometimes certain mixes of salt work a little bit better at lower temperatures. Sodium chloride, for instance, really only works down to about 15 degrees. So at that temperature, you're going to have to switch to something else. Maybe use sand for traction. It won't help with melting, but it can help with some traction in that case, especially right now if you folks are having a lot of ice on your roadways and walkways as well. And I did want to show some pictures here. So there are two different ways typically that road salt is applied. The left picture of that snowplow on the back of the snowplow, it's showing a granular application. And this is more of like the traditional road salt application that we're used to seeing. It is usually done when there is snow and ice already present, and its fancy term is called de-icing. So there's already ice and snow present. They're hopefully plowing first and then putting some of this salt down, and it's de-icing, and it's a granular form of salt. There's also on the right-hand side, you can see some of those lines on that roadway. This is a newer form of applying salt or salt application. It's called a brine treatment. And so it's a water salt mixture that is typically applied before anticipated weather events. And it's called anti-icing. Essentially what happens is they're spraying the roadways with this brine mixture, and that's creating sort of a layer between the roadway and whatever precipitation is about to come down on top of the roadway. And so it prevents things from sticking onto the roadways. There are gaps between those lines, and that's really effective for that salt to actually work. And unlike the granular application as well, the brine application, it helps to prevent things like bounce. So that salt isn't just sort of coming out of the truck, bouncing off of the roadways or bouncing off the roadways if cars are driving by as well. So this is one way that's really helpful that counties and state agencies are using to reduce their road salt amount. And in some cases, they can reduce their road salt amount by 30 up to maybe 70% by doing things like this brine application. So if you see that, that's really good. I did want to show this picture really quickly by Wisconsin SaltWise. So salt does a lot of things, and I'm going to talk about some of the impacts that road salt has on our environment and ecosystem. But I just wanted to leave this little message. It only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. So salt is something that most wastewater treatment facilities, they do not have the funding or the infrastructure to remove it from the water. And so it's very persistent in the environment. Once it enters the environment, it really doesn't go away. It's almost impossible to get out in a lot of cases. And so that salt just keeps building up and building up and building up. And it does end up in our drinking water and things as well. And I'll talk about that here in one moment, but only 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. Some different wildlife impacts. So salt, it really does affect fish, but some other organisms like macroinvertebrates, so that picture at the top there, like mayfly larvae, damselfly larvae, caddisflies, all of those can be really affected. Plankton and microbes may be even more sensitive than fish as well. So some of those smaller organisms that are the basis of that food chain within the environment, the aquatic ecosystem, they can be affected and then throw off the rest of the food chain as a result. Vernal pools, which are seasonal waterways, they appear after the thaw of snow melt events, basically. They can be more intensely affected, as well as organisms like frogs and toads and salamanders that lay their eggs or spawn in them. And then mammals can be impacted as well from high chloride in streams. And then also deer and moose and birds even, they sometimes go to roadways and use them as salt licks. And so that directly puts them into our way as drivers on roadways as well. Some drinking water impacts. Chloride is different than chlorine. It does not disinfect the water. As I mentioned, it's not typically removed at water treatment plants due to the high cost, and it can impact public health. As I'm sure quite a few of you remember, in 2014, there was a water crisis in Flint, Michigan. One of the reasons that happened was because they actually switched their water source directly to the Flint River, and it was April of 2014. So the chloride in the water was elevated from the snow season and road salt being applied to the roadways. They never put in anti-corrosives in the water, and chloride is incredibly corrosive, and it actually corroded all of that lead and copper in people's pipes, and that ended up in their drinking water. So direct impact to us, very corrosive. And so some things that we're trying to avoid happening again. So just to show you what our program looks like from a nationwide perspective, as of Monday, we had 11,710 data points that volunteers across the country shared with us. We have different ranges to let us know what sort of where these samples fall. 29% of the samples were considered excellent. Between 0 and 30 parts per million, that's milligrams per liter, that level is what's most streams are naturally within that range, between 0 and 30 parts per million. That next droplet, the 34% of samples are good. Below 100 parts per million, many streams are, that's the natural range with many streams. So between 0 and 30 parts per million, most streams are within that level naturally. 100 parts per million and below, many streams are within that level naturally, but it might be an elevated level for some streams. 20% of the samples that we've received nationwide are between 100 and 230 parts per million. Once a chloride level goes up to 230 parts per million, that's considered chronically toxic for a lot of those organisms, those freshwater organisms that live in those waterways. And then above that 230 parts per million, that can get up to even acutely toxic and can be instantly toxic to a lot of those organisms. So unfortunately, 17% of the samples that we have received from across the country, they're above that chronically toxic level, and some of them might even be acutely toxic to some of those macroinvertebrates. Narrowing in on Minnesota itself, of all of those data points that we've received, over 1,000 of them have been from Minnesota. 20% of the samples that we've received are excellent, 23% are good, 14% fair, and then 36% have been toxic. So lots of toxic areas or waterways within Maryland as far as chloride levels are concerned. And I'll go into a little bit more depth as far as Duluth specifically. So I stole some of these screen grabs from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website. They have a map of Minnesota, and they have a couple different designations on this map. For Duluth specifically, the purple that you're seeing here, this is actually showing road density. And so throughout the entire state of Minnesota, road density, which they show in purple, they're looking at road density above 18%. So within Duluth, that upper area, the road density is 27.25%. That center area in the purple, road density is 39.94%. And then that lower area, all the way down, road density is 31.36%. The reason they're looking at road density is because in a lot of cases, it's correlated with high levels of chloride. The more impervious surfaces that we have, the higher chloride tends to be in a lot of areas. And so cities, for instance, they tend to be hot spots of chloride. And then here's what those other things are. These are actually creeks that are shown, and I'll go through all of the orange colored ones first, and then the next slide will have what these red designations mean. So for all of these orange creeks that are shown here, they are considered not impaired, but high risk. So of those streams or creeks, Tisher Creek, Chester Creek, Coffee Creek, and Merritt Creek in and around Duluth are considered not impaired, but high risk. And then there are 3 creeks that are considered impaired. Those creeks are Miller Creek, Keene Creek, and Kingsbury Creek. And if anyone has any questions about sort of what those levels look like, I do have those numbers and I can talk about them after the presentation if anyone has any questions. But all of that data is accessible at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency website. So if anyone is interested in signing up for a SaltWatch kit, basically you just go to our website, and the link is at the end of the presentation, and I can put it in the chat as well. It's saltwatch.org. The SaltWatch kits that we send out, they are free, and they include 4 chloride testing strips, instructions for how to sample, and instructions for how to upload your data. And then I also included conversion chart there too, and I can talk about that here in a little bit as well, how to convert your strip number to actually what the chloride level is within that waterway. If you do join the program, if you're interested in signing up, one question that we have frequently is when or how often should I monitor? We originally used to be the Winter SaltWatch program, because it was a citizen science project that people could be involved in during the winter time. But we've changed our name to simply SaltWatch because we're realizing that chloride levels, they are elevated year round. And so it's really important to learn what's happening in a waterway throughout the entire year. But if you only have time to go out 4 times, we ask that you try to sample before winter weather to get a baseline reading, after the first storm, when salt has been applied to roadways, after the first thaw or rainstorm of the winter, and then after the next rain event. However, if you're interested in sampling throughout the year, you can keep requesting kits. I'll keep sending them to you as long as I still have them. And we ask that you sample as consistently as possible if you're sampling throughout the year, such as the first Saturday of every month or first Sunday of every month, something like that. Just to show you how the sampling process works, it's really easy, really quick. You only need one of the test strips from your kit, a small jar or cup, ideally plastic or glass, and you add water to the cup, and you should rinse out your cup 3 times. So what that looks like is you fill it up with water, empty it out, fill it up, empty it out, fill it up, empty it out, and then fill it up just to about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water remaining at the bottom of the cup. The reason you do that is to make sure that there's no residue in your cup. If you're sampling at another location earlier, that doesn't contaminate your sample. And then the test itself only takes about 3 minutes. So after you have that 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water, you put your strip in. It should say Quantab here at the top of the strip, and you wait about 3 minutes until that top of the strip here turns a black color. And then you know that your sample is ready to be read. Once you get to that point, you can bring out your conversion chart, which looks like this white picture here in the background, and you can actually put your chloride sample directly onto that conversion chart, and you will be taking a picture of this and submitting that as part of our submission process. And you want to read how many Quantab units, how many units this strip is actually showing you. So I zoomed in a little bit here for you, and basically what you're looking at is the peak of that white or yellow line on that Quantab strip. In this case, it goes up to 4 right here. So 4 Quantab units. And then using your conversion chart, you go over you go over to your Quantab units here, and you go down to 4 and across to find out what that parts per million or milligram per liter of chloride is. And in this case, 4 Quantab units equals 157 parts per million. So that's how you read your test strip. Once you have all of that, you can actually report that data to us. It's all online. It's very easy to do. If you have a smartphone and you have service in your sampling location, you can do this over an app. If you don't, if you just have a regular phone or a camera, you can use that and then submit it later on a desktop. Either way works. If you're submitting it on your smartphone or desktop, you can sign up for a free account on Water Reporter. That's Water Reporter, I believe it's .org. And or you can download the app. The app looks like this here on the left-hand side, that water droplet that says Water Reporter. And follow the prompts for that. You want to make sure that you're searching for the Izaak Walton League of America, and then you click follow to join the group, and then you can submit data directly to us. How this looks on the app, if you decide to use that. Once you're ready to submit a result, maybe you're out in the field, you confirm the location of your report. If you're out in the field with your phone, it will automatically put in that location as long as you have enabled location services. You can add a description of maybe it rained yesterday, it's sunny today, this is the date that I'm sampling, anything like that. Tell us a little bit about your site. You can add a photo to the report, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. It should be of that conversions chart and that chloride strip. All of that sent in. You can click at the very bottom to share your result with the Izaak Walton League, and then you submit your report. It's as easy as that. It only takes a couple minutes to do. Once you've submitted your report, it should look like this on the Water Reporter feed. It'll have a picture. This hopefully picture will have, again, that conversion chart and that Quantab strip. It will tell you the date that you submitted your report. It'll show your description that you've submitted. It'll show that you've tagged the Izaak Walton League of America. And then it'll also tell you what watershed you're in. So if you didn't know ahead of time, it's a cool, some cool information to learn about. After you've submitted data, or maybe you don't want to submit any data, but you want to make a difference in your community with road salt pollution, you can always let someone know. That includes if you're finding really large salt spills or just an over-salting event near you, you can let someone know about that. You can report some of those readings if you are taking readings to a local watershed entity. You can call your city or county if you're seeing some of those salt spills. We also have templates on our website for letters to the editor or letters to different state representatives as well. And you can share your road salt best practices with property owners, community managers, and state agencies. Again, those little actions that you're taking, talking to a neighbor, talking to a student, things like that, they really go a long way, even if we think that they don't. On our website, there's a link that says what you can do. And again, the link to our website will be at the end of this presentation. And there's some additional advocacy actions that you can take as you're learning about salt or taking some action about salt as well. And I wanted to share this photo with you. We recently did a little photo shoot in front of our national office. The photo here on the left, this is maybe what we're used to seeing in a lot of places. There's just lots of salt. Sometimes you could almost slip on the salt because there's so much. The picture on the right, though, is actually how much salt you should be putting down. And I'll have another visual of this in a moment, but a 12-ounce mug, so your typical coffee mug, that actually holds enough salt to salt a 20-foot long driveway or 10 sidewalk squares, so about 2 parking spaces. So that's all the salt that you need. And that salt should be spaced out about 3 inches between granules. Again, it works a lot better when it's spread apart. And you don't have to go out and measure how much salt is in this area. But this is a little visual of what it should actually look like. And then this is a picture of what that salt actually looks like from above. So a really spread out, not all clumped together. And I wanted to leave you with this. This is sort of our messaging that we're sharing right now. Shovel early and often, clear those walkways before snow turns to ice. And that makes it so you have less salt to put down as well. Scatter, again, a 12-ounce mug holds enough salt to treat a 20-foot driveway or 10 sidewalk squares. And then you can actually, a lot of people don't know this, you can sweep up excess salt and actually reuse it during the next salting event too. So another way to make it so that you're putting less salt in the environment, you're cleaning some of that up. And so if anyone has any questions, I'll leave this here for a minute and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob. You can visit our website, and I'll put this in the chat in a moment. Our website is saltwatch.org, and that does link you to the National Izaak Walton League webpage as well. You can also email me directly at saltwatch@iwla.org. You can request kits by going to the SaltWatch website, or you can email me directly to request kits. If you're doing an event or maybe helping out with a school program or an environmental center, or even as a chapter, if you want to request more than one kit, we do send out bulk orders as well for people who are interested. Email me and let me know a good address to send those kits, and I'll do my best to send those to you. And I want to leave you with this as well. More salt does not equal more melting. Again, that salt needs to be spread out in order to work. And we can all do a little part to make a really big difference in the environment and for ourselves, our own drinking water as well. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bob. And feel free, put your questions in the chat if you have any, and we will answer some questions after Bob's presentation. Thank you.
Am I on?
You're good to go.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bob Tamman, and as most of you know, I worked in the mine several years ago. I started in the late 60s doing electrical work. I worked at Mintac and I helped build Hibbing Tac. Modified the old reserve plan of Silver Bay to get them to stop dumping tailings in the lake, into Lake Superior. So I have a pretty good picture of the geography of the Iron Range. And I'll have to admit, in my younger days, I wasn't really aware of how much mining company water was going into our public waters. And as we start getting a little more publicity about wild rice and sulfates and turbidity and our babies being born with elevated mercury, I started paying attention. And back then I learned that Mintac's tailings pond was leaking 4 million gallons a day. That's a good little batch of water. And being I was an electrician, I was interested in conductivity. How good does that water carry electricity? And, we know that clean water, distilled water, conductivity is down pretty close to zero. If you go into a taconite tailings pond, you're probably going to see conductivity up close to 1,000 microsiemens. That's a term they use to describe conductivity. Usually our lakes, our surface water in northern Minnesota runs between 10 and 100 microsiemens. If you go out on Highway 1 to Dunnigan Lake is about a little over 10. Isabella Lake, just inside the boundary waters, that runs the low 20s. Then if you go to an old mine pit that's been mined out and they've allowed it to flood, you're probably talking over 300 microsiemens. And then, as I mentioned, if you get into these tailings pond where the final grind is the consistency of face powder, you're getting over 1,000 microsiemens. And a year or so ago, Pat and I made an effort to get a sample below every operating taconite plant. And every one of those plants was degrading our public waters. They had elevated conductivity. And, like I said, I'm an electrician, I'm interested in electricity. And so I went and got a conductivity meter. And actually, it's very simple to take a measurement. I brought my little meter here. It's less than $150. You take off the protective cap, you dip it in the water a couple inches into the lake or the river, and in a minute or so, you've got a reading. And I'll have to admit, I'm getting a little older, and I fell in a couple times. So nowadays, I take a big cup along with me. I take a grab sample, I find a nice flat spot to set down, and I get my measurement. Now, conductivity picks up a lot of different compounds. Excuse me, I'm going to have to stop my video and restart it. I'm getting flickering. Anyhow, if you see an elevated reading, maybe you want some more measurements. Little bottle like this is a big enough sample. We go to RMB labs in Hibbing, and for $20, you get a sulfate reading. I also have a remote sampler. Now this is meant for subsurface samples. What I use it for is to take samples off of bridges. If you want to go get the St. Louis River, the Embarrass River, you can just go to the bridge, drop it in the water, pop the little release, and you've got your sample. And being I mentioned the St. Louis River, perhaps I should talk about that just a minute. I'm pretty sure that most of the people on this call are paying attention to the St. Louis River. You got the estuary down there. Well, Pat and I live up closer to the headwaters. And so if we get a nice spring day, maybe we'll take a little drive and I'll grab a few samples. If I go east of Aurora, where I'm above mining company discharges, the reading is going to be in the 50s range. Then I drop down a few miles, get south and west of Aurora, where you're picking up mining company runoff over 500. Then you drop down a little farther, it improves, maybe 300. You drop down a little farther, you pick up United Taconite discharge over 400. Then you drop down some more, you've got the Whiteface River, the Cloquet River, cleaner than the St. Louis River. So they're diluting some of that mining company runoff, but you're still getting our mining company runoff in your estuary. So it's important that we push on controlling this mining company runoff. Pat and I own property near where the South Coishaway River flows into Birch Lake. And of course, we grab samples right there to see what our water is like. And it's good. It's probably less than 50 microsiemens because that water is coming out of the boundary waters. Then we go down Birch Lake 6 or 7 miles close to the old Duncan mine site where Unnamed Creek dumps into Bob Bay. And early in the spring, when you got a lot of snowmelt runoff, it'll probably be below 500. Then when you start getting mostly runoff off of those old mine dumps that are from the Duluth complex, it'll pop up over 1,000. So Birch Lake is being used to dilute mining company runoff. They should be cleaning that up on mining company property rather than dumping it in to Birch Lake for us to dilute it. And for your information, Birch Lake also has a Klobuchar Bay. And I've often hoped that maybe Senator Amy would take a real interest in cleaning up Birch Lake, but I can't say we've heard a lot from her so far. But as far as cleaning up, I think we should expect that the mining industry is going to drag their heels on real cleanups. With our existing iron mining situation, we started out over 100 years ago with an ore body that was over 60% iron. And of course, we mined that out. So now we're down to 25% iron. And as I mentioned before, that final grind is the consistency of face powder to get that iron out of there. And so it takes a lot of energy. And so when we're concerned about carbon, mining in Minnesota is an energy pig. And I'd like to bring in the proposed copper and nickel mines. I think we're faced with a similar situation as we've gone through with iron mining. Now, the Duluth complex is just huge. It is a big ore body. When people say it's a rich ore body, well, it's not really rich. It's big. The vast majority of that ore body is less than 1% copper. The thing is, though, you've got a few plums here and there. You know, over Tamarack, a little part of that is richer. So the mining companies come in, they've got a little story with the little part of the ore body that's richer. They can sell stock and get the banks to finance them. And then when the rich ore is gone, they got all that machinery. They're going to want to mine out that lower grade ore if they can make any profit. And if they want to make a profit, they're going to want regulatory relief. They're going to want import duties. They're going to want to fill our wetlands. And so I think coming up in the future, we can expect more battles to protect Minnesota's wetlands, but you know, that's why we're here. So anyhow, that's pretty much what I have on conductivity. I'd like to thank Abby for a great presentation. You know, I saw that slide with the macroinvertebrates. You know, there was a study a few years ago. They sampled a stream and the conductivity had raised quite a bit, and they did a count of macroinvertebrates, and they had, well, we got about the same amount of macroinvertebrates, but then they dug a little deeper and they discovered that they might have the same number of macroinvertebrates, but they had different macroinvertebrates. The sensitive ones, the mayflies that all us fishermen are caring about, they die out. And the less sensitive ones take over that spot in the food chain. So anyhow, it's Minnesota's water. So I'd like to thank the Ikes for keeping up the good fight. You know, Pat and I came into the Ikes many years ago. Lynn Anderson brought us in. And I think, you know, Lynn Anderson was a great human being, and the Ikes is a great organization. So keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob and Abby. Bob, could you just, I don't know if you said, but when you talked to me on the phone, you mentioned who you're working with or through on the monitoring that you're doing and where your data is going that you're collecting.
You know, I'll have to admit, I started out over 10 years ago, kind of like the Lone Ranger going out with my conductivity meter. And all of a sudden you're starting to see patterns come up, and we need more than just some individual going out and getting a measurement here and there. When you're going to submit those measurements, you have to follow scientific procedures. You have to have chain of custody. And so the last few years, I've been working with the Northern Lake Scientific Advisory Panel. And so usually a couple times a year, we'll go out and grab a bunch of samples at once. You want pretty much the same weather pattern. And we'll start up at Crane Lake, where the Vermilion River runs in there, grab samples there, come on down, St. Louis River, Embarrass River, Midtack leaks a lot into the Dark River on the west side. We'll grab samples there, Dark River, Dark Lake. So anyhow, then we're careful to follow protocols. And if we're going to have some people who take us seriously, you got to follow the scientific procedures. And I think we're seeing progress on that. Save the Boundary Waters is doing work in Birch Lake, and Northern Lake Scientific Advisory Panel is doing Birch Lake stuff, and especially the Embarrass River, the Partridge River, where it dumps into the St. Louis. And when I mentioned the St. Louis River having really elevated sulfates in some places, it's probably taking it up out of the Partridge River, the first spot where it gets a good slug of it. So as we look at the challenges of cleaning up, we have quite a few in different areas, but we're making progress. I think the publicity is maybe getting to them. We might get a TMDL on mercury pretty soon. So we just have to keep plugging away.
Great, thank you, Bob. And you said thank you to the Ikes, and that thank you should go to you, because you're one of those people that's out there doing the work. And I think it's a inspiration for others to realize that this work gets done by everyone. So thank you for what you're doing.
Maybe I should mention one of the things I like about running around with my conductivity meter. If you want to do a sulfate sample, it's probably going to cost you $20 to go to the lab. And so if you're sampling a dozen different rivers and lakes, it can add up. And if you want to do some other compounds, of course, most of us interested in conductivity and salt and sulfates, we're interested in methyl mercury in unborn babies. And I asked him one time, what does it cost for a methyl mercury sample? And I think it was several $100s and 2 gallons of water. And I thought, that's a little out of my ballpark. But anyhow, it's important for organizations to be involved, to bring their resources to clean up our water.
Thank you. I think this is a good segue to, I had asked Abby in the chat if she would maybe talk about how you pick a spot to sample from if you want to do this. I'm thinking of a creek that crosses our road, and I know I wouldn't want to sample right off the road, I don't think, but maybe if you could talk a little bit about how to pick a sampling point for those who want to get involved.
Certainly. So I would say the best thing to look at first is something that would be easy to access. It is something that you can sample from like bridges and things. You can get a bucket on a pulley and put it down. But for me personally, I like sampling from a bank. You don't have to go into the water for the chloride tests, which make it a little bit nicer. So I'd find something that doesn't have a steep bank. If you'd have to drive to the location, make sure there's a safe place to park your car, that you're wearing really visible clothing as well. So no steep banks, easy access. And then I'd have something that's close to you too. So if you are sampling, you don't have to go very far for it. If you're sampling closer to a roadway, maybe there's a bridge that goes over the road, the closer you sample to that roadway, the higher those chloride levels are going to be. If you're going upstream, they might be a little bit lower, since the road salt might not be getting to that place from that particular road. And then if you're sampling further downstream, they might be a little bit lower, but still probably more elevated than that upstream location too. So you could even sample maybe both locations, above the bridge and below the bridge, and compare some of those samples. But we don't have very much data, especially around the Duluth area. So any samples that we get, we would love to have. More data tells us what's happening in our backyards. So the better for that. And I did want to mention too, Jill mentioned in the chat a bill about basically its best management practices for salt. Minnesota Pollution Control has a really good salt applicator training program already to train people how to apply salt in an environment in a way that they're using less salt, and so protecting waterways and the environment. There's a bill that's currently in session that is establishing a limited liability for contractors who are certified sort of smart salt contractors. And so it would allow it so they wouldn't be liable if they're following those best management practices, applying less salt, that they would have liability insurance or liability or no liability if somebody were to slip and fall in an area that they are salting. So if you're interested in looking that up, Jill has that bill number in the chat. It's HF 820 and SF 755. So something that would be good to check out if you're interested. And that link is posted as well for the Minnesota Smart Salt training too.
Are there other questions for either Abby or Bob?
I was just wondering, do you have, who's doing sampling? Like, you wouldn't want to have two people sampling the same spot, or is there anything like that? So
Yeah, so as a chapter, if that's something that somebody wants to spearhead coordinating, that's something that some organizations do is these are some locations that we're interested in. Go ahead and sample these different locations. So it's sort of divvied out a little bit more, or you could communicate amongst yourselves. If you are sampling the same stream, sometimes those chloride levels, they do change even sometimes within the hour. So if salt has just been applied to a roadway and you're sampling a location, it might have just spiked and then maybe that level has gone down if there's a large snow melt event, and so there's more water that's coming into the water body or stream. So those levels, they do fluctuate quite a bit. So even if you are sampling the same location as someone else, that's totally fine. But if you as a chapter want to sort of divvy out some of those sample locations, that would work as well. I don't have a list of streams being sampled currently, but you can actually go to our website again, saltwatch.org. And if you click on the link for our results page, we do have a map of samples that have been reported to us for this season. And so you can actually zoom in and look at some of those streams that are being sampled around the country, but also within your area, if there are any samples or streams being sampled near you.
Abby, I have a question. I was wondering if you have any sense of what proportion of the salt pollution in residential urban areas is a result of the highway authorities versus business owners and residence owners. My experience is, their impression is that the road authorities are trying to do a better job of salt application, but the average business and person I see, they way over salt. Have you got any sense of how that adds up in the in the end?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's actually one of the reasons why this bill is going through for the state of Minnesota, is because if more people have an incentive to become smart salt applicators, such as through limited liability protection, they're more likely to learn how to apply salt. The problem that we have been seeing is that most cases, the issue is not with the state or the departments of transportation, but it is with the contracted applicator or just the average business owner who has no idea how much salt to apply, when to apply the salt, or any sort of formula of background knowledge of what to do and when. People who go through that training, they are given essentially a formula of what type of salt to apply, what mixture of salt to apply, whether you're de-icing or anti-icing, all of that information. And also something I wanted to mention with that question, a lot of people who are applicators, they have no idea how much salt to apply. And many contractors are actually contracted by the bag or the poundage of salt for the year. And so the more salt they're applying, the more they're getting paid as well. And so that's a really big problem that a lot of places are dealing with. And so that's why it's important to learn more. I had no idea how much salt to put down. And the bags that you're sold in stores aren't very helpful either. A lot of them say that they're pet safe or eco-friendly, but in most cases, they actually still contain chloride and they're not eco-friendly or pet safe. So there's no regulation on that packaging for those bags too. So that was a really good question. We are seeing a lot of those applicators are the ones who are over-salting a lot. The states and departments of transportation, they're using our tax dollars to purchase the salt. And so they're trying to limit the amount of salt that they're putting down. So then that tax money can go to bigger and better things. So they're trying to do their best during their salt application.
Bob, this is Rich. I got a question for you. I was wondering if you had any sense of what the components were in the mine runoff that's causing the high conductivity. I imagine it's multiple components, but
Yeah, they've done, typically, we're interested in the sulfates and the wild rice. That's what kind of drives Northern Lakes. But they've done tests like, for instance, Mintax tailings pond. They were out of compliance 20, 30 years ago. It was sulfates, chlorides, and turbidity. That's what Mintax tailings pond was out of compliance for. So that gives you the background for, and the others are most likely similar. And as far as Mintac, I throw out that number 4 million gallons a day. That might be changing over years. They've started pumping back on their east side, which goes into the Sandy River. On the west side, it goes into the Dark River, Dark Lake. And I don't believe they're completing their pump back yet. But the important thing is, they're pumping back surface water. And so we've still got that groundwater to contend with. So whatever we're degrading our water with, we still got it. And you notice I use the word degraded, degradation a lot, because the mining companies, they'll try to do a little public relations and say, well, we're in compliance with our permits. And the trouble is, I think they're sitting at the table when those permits are written. They have some pretty liberal permits. But if you look at the numbers, Minnesota has a non-degradation clause in their statutes and in their rules. What they say is our goal is non-degradation of public waters. So if you have clean water, it shouldn't matter what the discharge standard is. All that should matter is that they don't degrade that clean water that we already have. And so I think that's important for us in the Izaak Walton League. We don't want water that just meets the sad minimum requirements. We want water that's clean. And so I use the word degradation because they are degrading that public waters. I can take my little conductivity meter all over northern Minnesota, and I can find a clean lake and go 20 miles away and find a mining company, and I find degraded water.
So Bob, this is Dave Zettner. You use a good example with Mintac, and I know you know this, but I want to remind all of us, they operated for 30 years without a permit because the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Mintac could not come to terms on what that permit directed them to do, and they were able, with the legislative help, to continue to operate and do that discharge from that tailings basin you described, which is a point source, in my opinion, and should be treated as a point source. But anyway, just a little speech, I guess, from me on how difficult these things can be to navigate. Abby, I wanted to just thank you for being with us. It was a great presentation. I am compulsive about wanting to deal with these things once we get that monitoring and I know that SaltWatch has just had a young life with us, and you've done marvelous things. But is there anything on the drawing board to take that data to the responsible regulatory resource and say, okay, there has to be a game plan here to take this stretch of XY River and move it from exceedance to compliance. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's something we're working on. The EPA has different sort of tier systems of what is sort of the most rigorous data that they're receiving. And so we're hoping, most strips, by the way, things that are tested in strips are not put within any of those tiers that they have. We're hoping that we can get the chloride strips into one of those tiers, sort of the lower tier, because we can use our data to inform of especially chloride hotspots that are happening. Since we're not like a conductivity reading for like the USGS monitors, they have a lot of conductivity readings across the country that are continually monitoring data and giving you that data at sort of a real-time snapshot. Since a lot of our monitors, maybe they're only going out 4 times a year, we're not getting that continuous data, and it's impossible for a human to be out there with the sample monitoring every single second for chloride using our tests. So we are working on getting our data onto sort of that tiered list. And so people can use then our data for education and then to inform of hotspots that are happening, chloride spikes, elevations, anything that's over those naturally occurring limits of chloride within the environment. And even though it's not part of those tiers yet, that's still something that you can use to inform like your local stormwater authority. You can use it to inform Minnesota pollution control of, hey, maybe we should look at these streams a little bit more closely. I just got this reading of this number parts per million of chloride. We need to do something about this. And you can also use that data, for instance, if you're sampling near a really large parking space or parking lot, or a privately owned roadway that somebody puts way too much salt on, you can use your monitoring data to inform those people directly. And please don't go up to them and be like, hey, you're doing this, this is bad. Being really kind and, hey, I've been monitoring this stream for this period of time, and I noticed that the chloride levels are really high, and it could be linked to the amount of salt that is being put in this area. Here's some resources maybe to how to limit that amount of salt, or some certified applicators if you are contracting someone to apply that salt. And here's some information on how to reduce the amount of salt that's being put into the environment, and also to save money as a result of reducing the salt that you're personally purchasing to put down on this sidewalk or parking lot as well. So that's how we're using that data currently. And again, we're hoping that the EPA will allow it to become within their tiers to inform on what's happening within streams across the country.
Well, thank you.
You know, Dave, maybe we should put my wife Pat in charge of the salt business, because once in a great while, I'd like to put a little salt or sand or kitty litter on our back step. And she says, no, it makes a mess in the house. You know, we're both octogenarians, and one of these years, one of us is going to break a leg, but she's the boss, so we do it her way.
I hear you, Bob.
Abby, I would like to ask you a question. You so well described what to do, and don't put this much salt down. You can get better results with, or as good a result using less salt. But I have now switched to this pet-friendly salt, and I could see informing, I'm the League of Women Voters, and I could see informing our members of what you said here. But does this apply to any salt that you would put down, the more pet friendly? Does it need to be, what are you basing this information on?
Yeah, good question. So whenever you're purchasing salt, I would see if there are ingredients in the package. Most of the salts, and I think there are a couple that are being put on the market that are labeled as pet friendly that do not contain chloride, but any of those things that are listed as salts that contain chloride, that's what we're specifically really looking at. There are a couple of alternatives out there. CMA, which is calcium magnesium acetate. That is an alternative that is supposed to be more environmentally neutral that you could apply, but it's very expensive. And so that's why a lot of people have not made that switch. Some people use different things as well outside of salt. I would avoid using fertilizer. I would avoid using urea or any urea containing products because that can cause algae blooms and eutrophication events and then dead zones in water. So avoid using those things. And if you are using something like maybe kitty litter or sand to put down to create traction, but not to melt the salt, try to sweep some of that up after a snow melt event as well, because that can create some sedimentation issues within storm drains and things as well. But look at the packaging on the bag and do a little bit more research onto what is actually contained in that bag of salt that you're buying, because there are different mixtures out there. Some of them, like I said earlier, have different melting points as well. And who was it in the chat? Judy mentioned that the city of Duluth, for instance, uses beet juice in their brining application. Beet juice alone won't make a difference, but it does help to lower that freezing point as a mixture within the salt or the brine application that the city is putting down. So look at the ingredients within those bags, and you can make more of an informed decision based on that. But again, if it's containing chloride, then that is impacting the environment in some form.
So but what is it that you got these numbers from? 10 sidewalk squares, 20 feet of driveway. What kind of product was being used to give this information?
Okay, yeah, good question. So any granular salt.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so use that 12-ounce coffee mug to salt those 10 sidewalk squares or the 20-foot driveway. Any sort of granular salt should work for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Abby and Bob?
Madam President, this is again. Can I have one more question
Oh, absolutely, Dave.
for Abby? Is there a metric, going back to my pension here for trying to well, for all of us, not just me, improve. Is there a metric for road conditions per mile of road, let's say, just hypothetically here, that we know is adequate to provide driver safety on asphalt or concrete, whatever it happens to be, and that the operators of the trucks that are metering out the application are trained and required not to apply more than. Do we have anything like that in the system? And with the public agency being responsible for it. In the town of Duluth, I've seen almost bare pavement, and here comes a snowplow truck with a salt applicator spewing salt all over the place. Now, there may be a forecast coming or something. What's going on with that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think you should be able to see some of those resources within the Minnesota Pollution Control Training website, as far as what some of those metrics look like. If you can't see it directly without signing up for the training or completing the training, it is also available at Wisconsin SaltWatch, and I can find their website and write that in the chat really quickly too. And they do have different metrics as far as, and it does depend on weather conditions as well. Here we go. This is their applicator guidelines and calculator that I'm putting in the chat right now. And again, that's Wisconsin SaltWatch. But again, it depends on what's happening. If there's a lot of snow that is falling, they're gonna apply this product and this amount of that product. And I know I was speaking to some folks in New York a couple weeks ago, and half of their township had new machines and new calibration tools, and then the other half didn't. And so that might be something that some counties or cities are running into. Some of those machines are quite pricey. And so, yeah, it really depends on the area that you're in, and what equipment that they have on hand. But ideally, if they've taken the training, or if they're part of a state or city government, they should have that background knowledge to be able to make those decisions based on the formulas that they're given.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Julie?
and then also on that too, they should also, if they, and I don't know if Minnesota has a number for this or the city of Duluth has a number. I know we do in Maryland, but if you do see salt spills, then there should be a resource that you can call or report that salt spill, and someone should clean it up. And again, I'm not sure if that's something Minnesota does, but I hope that it does. And I can look into finding that resource too, if that is available, and I can send that to Julie after the presentation.
Great, thanks. Jill, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna make a suggestion. The watershed districts in the metro area work a lot together and with PCA to do training. So I know like a lot of the cities are putting down the brine and they're really watching the weather reports, just like Abby's talking about. But we're trying to do more outreach. And so like homeowner associations, I don't know how many you might have in your area, but churches might be places to reach out to make sure that if they're interested in being educated about some of this and being connected up with PCA to get the training. So there are opportunities out there. It's just trying to hunt them down. And Bob, we do electrofishing where I am in my watershed district. So I tried to offer, since we've got fish tissue, that maybe they could use that to test for mercury and PFAs, but they don't have any place to store the data, or they weren't interested. But it just
Did I hear
seems
you
like-
say they do some electrofishing?
Yeah, in the watershed
Oh,
district. So
Okay,
because
you
we've
might
got
find
like
it interesting.
Yeah, we've got 13 lakes and we had common carp, and we've got those pretty well in check with using bluegills. But I mean, they test all the time, staff does. And so you got the tissue. It'd be nice if they could to use it.
You
But-
might
and I
find
don't
it
know how many-
interesting that,
Yeah, I don't know how many groups around or people around the state might be doing electrofishing, but it'd be interesting to be able to get some of that sampled and checked.
you know, a while back I was talking, I believe it was Nancy Schultz, the Fond du Lac water lady. I forget what her exact title is, but anyhow, I was talking to her about conductivity, and she says there's a few lakes in northern Minnesota, the conductivity is so low, their electrofishing equipment does not work. And I wish I'd have asked her which ones.
Well, that's good though. Thanks, you guys. That's great. Good to see you, Bob.
Well,
Thank you.
if there are no more questions for Bob and Abby, I have copied the chat and we'll make sure that we get those resources out to people, and anything additional that you would send us a follow-up, Abby. But this has been really informative presentation. So I just thank you both for being here. And I also just want to point out that I think this points to the difference that citizens can make and the importance of people getting involved in hands-on ways to just start collecting information that then can be used to result in some action on things. So thank you both. If everybody wants to unmute yourself, and let's give Bob and Abby a hand. or do it virtually.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. And I, I should clarify, I said that I fell in a couple times, but the water was only a foot deep, so I wasn't traumatized by the whole business.
Well, and in closing, I want to point out that we're going to have more of this year. Since it's our anniversary, we figured we should be hearing from our members because so many of our members are doing really good and important work that they do behind the scenes and often don't get recognized for. So thank you, Bob, for what you're doing. If there are others who are doing something you'd like to talk about at one of our meetings, please let us know. Our March meeting, actually March 15th, we'll be back at Hartley Nature Center, and we're going to hear from Martha Minchak about a recent trip that she made to Cuba and some of the work that's happening in Cuba with regreening and rewilding the island, work to develop a land ethic, and some of the challenges that Cuba and the Cuban people are facing. So that'll be in person, and you'll want to be there. It'll probably still be really miserable weather, and we'll want to hear, all about more tropical climate. So so thanks everyone for being with us tonight, and stay safe out there. It's a skating rink.
Wow. Take care all. Thank you. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Good night,
you, everyone.
everybody.